On his wedding day, billionaire Ethan Thompson had it all, until a car crash left him in a coma. When he wakes up months later, his world is unrecognizable. Betrayed by those closest to him, the only person he can trust is Sarah, a kind hospital worker. But as danger looms, can love rewrite his fate? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun illuminated the gardens of the Thompson estate, where hundreds of white flower arrangements decorated the path to the altar. Ethan Thompson, at 32 years old, adjusted his Italian silk tie one last time in front of the mirror. His reflection revealed not only the impeccable designer suit, but also the face of someone who had achieved everything he had ever dreamed of. He was the CEO of one of the largest technology companies in the country, was about to marry Olivia Rothschild, and his fortune only grew. "It's almost time," said Jake, his best friend and best man, entering the room. "The guests are already arriving." Ethan smiled, but there was something in his eyes that betrayed uneasiness. Perhaps it was just the natural nervousness of a groom, but an inner voice insisted on questioning whether Olivia was really the right person. In recent months, since he had taken over the presidency of the company, she seemed more interested in appearing in the society columns than in building a life together. "I need to take a walk before the ceremony," said Ethan, grabbing the keys to his red Ferrari. Jake tried to argue that it wasn't a good idea, but he knew his friend well enough to know it was useless to try to stop him. The route along the winding road leading to the mansion had always been his refuge to organize his thoughts. The cool morning breeze came in through the car windows, bringing the scent of the ocean. Ethan slowed down as he approached a curve when a dog unexpectedly appeared on the road. As he swerved, he lost control of the vehicle. The world spun in slow motion. The impact was violent, and the last thing Ethan saw was the blue sky through the shattered windshield. At St. Luke's Hospital, the routine followed its normal flow. Sarah Miller, 28 years old, pushed her cleaning cart through the corridors of the ICU ward. Her brown hair was tied in a simple bun, and her light blue uniform contrasted with her tanned skin. Unlike many who worked there, she always dedicated a few minutes to talk to the patients, even those who were unconscious. The agitated arrival of a medical team caught her attention. She quickly moved her cart to make way for the stretcher carrying a young, well-dressed man, apparently the victim of a serious accident. In the hours that followed, the hospital was taken over by reporters and photographers. The patient was Ethan Thompson, the billionaire who should have been getting married at that moment. Sarah observed from afar the coming and going of important people, including an elegant woman who arrived crying dramatically but didn't stay. More than 15 minutes. At night, when the movement died down, Sarah entered the room to clean. She looked at the unconscious man in the bed and felt an inexplicable compassion. As she wiped the bedside table, she began to speak softly. "You know, Mr. Thompson, you chose a pretty important day to end up here. But don't worry, there are a lot of people rooting for your recovery." She had no idea that those simple words would mark the beginning of a story that would change not only Ethan's life but her own. In the days that followed, while the world speculated about the future of the Thompson empire, something much more valuable than any fortune would be born. Inside that hospital room, the night was advancing and Sarah finished her shift with one last look at the patient. "See you tomorrow, Mr. Thompson. Tomorrow I'll bring a book to read to you. Did you know they say people in comas can hear?" Outside the hospital, photographers were still on stakeout, eager for any news about the billionaire's health condition. But the true story, the one no one could have predicted, was just beginning to unfold in the silent corridors of that ICU. The days turned into weeks, and room 507 of the ICU became the stage for a parade of contrasting personalities. Olivia Rothschild, the fiancée, always appeared during the hours when there was the most press movement, wearing impeccable clothes and perfect makeup, as if each visit were a photo shoot. "My love, you need to wake up," she would say, fixing her hair while a photographer from Society and Power magazine captured the moment. "How am I going to organize our wedding without you?" Sarah, who was cleaning the corridor near the room, couldn't help but overhear these theatrical visits. She noticed how Olivia constantly checked her cell phone and barely touched Ethan. As soon as the cameras moved away, she would quickly say goodbye, always with an excuse about unavoidable commitments. During the night shifts, when silence dominated the hospital, Sarah took advantage of her breaks to enter room 507. She always carried a different book, borrowed from the public library near her house. She started with The Little Prince, her favorite story. What is essential is invisible to the eye, she read in a low voice, sitting in the armchair next to the bed. You know, Mr. Thompson, sometimes I think you might be listening. It must be hard to be here alone for so long. One night, Sarah noticed a subtle change in Ethan's expression. She immediately called the on-duty nurse, but the doctors assured her it was just an involuntary reflex. Even so, she maintained her routine of readings and conversations. Meanwhile, behind the scenes of the Thompson empire, suspicious movements began to happen. Alexander, Ethan's older brother, called an extraordinary meeting of the administrative board. With an old power of attorney in hand, he gradually began to take control of the companies. It's just temporary, he assured the shareholders, until my brother recovers. But his eyes revealed other intentions, especially when he met secretly with Michael Davis, Ethan's main competitor in the market. Alexander's visits to the hospital became increasingly rare, always accompanied by lawyers and papers for signature. Sarah observed everything with a mixture of concern and indignation. During her nightly conversations with Ethan, she shared her impressions. You have so many people around you, but sometimes you seem so alone, she commented while arranging the wilted flowers that Olivia had brought for the photos. But don't worry. As long as I'm here, you'll have company. One night, while reading Don Quixote, Sarah was surprised by a conversation in the corridor. Olivia was arguing with Alexander in raised tones. We need to resolve this soon, she was saying. I can't keep waiting indefinitely. The press is already starting to speculate about the wedding. Be patient, Alexander replied. Soon we'll have total control, and you'll have your part as we agreed. Sarah felt her heart tighten. Those words revealed much more than just concern for Ethan's health. She then decided that in addition to the readings, she would start telling Ethan everything she witnessed, hoping that somehow he could hear and understand. You need to wake up, she whispered gently, holding his hand. There's a lot going on that you need to know. That night, for the first time, Sarah felt a slight squeeze on her hand. It was so subtle that she could have imagined it, but her heart knew it was real. The heart monitor registered a small change, and she smiled, keeping that moment as a precious secret between them. Outside the hospital, life went on. The headlines about the billionaire in a coma were beginning to lose space to other scandals. But in the corridors of St. Luke's, a story of loyalty and true affection continued to develop, silent and deep, like the words of the books Sarah read every night. Autumn arrived in New York City, painting the trees in the hospital garden with golden hues. It had been 2 months since the accident, and the routine in room 507 had established itself in a strange rhythm. The doctors were becoming less optimistic about Ethan's chances of waking up, but Sarah refused to lose hope. Dr. Richards says your vital signs are stable, she told him one evening, while arranging fresh flowers she had bought with her own money. That's good news, right? She had just finished her shift, but didn't want to leave without seeing him. Over the weeks, her feelings for this man she had never really met had grown in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just compassion anymore, it was something deeper. That same night, Alexander Thompson arrived at the hospital with a team of specialized doctors from Europe. Sarah watched from a distance as they examined. Ethan, what are the chances of recovery? Alexander asked, his voice betraying no emotion. Honestly, Mr. Thompson, if he hasn't shown significant improvement after this time, the chances are very slim, said the specialist with a heavy German accent. I see. Alexander nodded, looking at his unconscious brother. Then perhaps we should consider other options. Quality of life and all that. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She didn't like the tone of that conversation. The next day, she arrived earlier for her shift and overheard a conversation between Olivia and her lawyer in the hospital cafeteria. Once Alexander gets control over medical decisions, we can move forward with our plan, the lawyer was saying. The prenuptial agreement you signed with Ethan becomes void if you're married, even if it's just for a day. Olivia nodded, sipping. her expensive coffee. And the ceremony can happen even with him in this state. Yes, there are precedents. We just need to make sure it's done before any decision is made about his life support. Sarah nearly dropped her tray. They were planning to marry Ethan while he was in a coma, just to get his money. And from what she understood, they might be planning to disconnect his life support afterward. That night, Sarah sat closer to Ethan's bed than ever before. "You need to fight, Ethan," she said, forgetting the formal Mr. Thompson for the first time. "Your brother and Olivia are planning something terrible. I don't know how to stop them, but I promise I'll find a way." As if responding to her plea, the monitors attached to Ethan began to show unusual activity. Sarah quickly called the nurse, who then called Dr. Richards. After examining him, the doctor looked surprised. "There's increased brain activity," he said. "It might not mean anything, but it means something," Sarah affirmed with certainty. "He can hear us. He's fighting to come back." Dr. Richards looked at her with a mixture of compassion and doubt. "You've been spending a lot of time with him, haven't you?" "Someone has to," she replied firmly. The next morning, Sarah was called to the hospital administration office. Her supervisor looked uncomfortable as he spoke. "Sarah, we've received a complaint about you spending too much time in Mr. Thompson's room outside your duties." He avoided her eyes. "The family has requested that you be reassigned to another floor." "The family?" Sarah questioned, knowing very well who was behind this. "You mean his brother?" "I can't discuss details." "You'll start on the 3rd floor tomorrow." Sarah left the office with her heart racing. They were trying to isolate Ethan from the one person who truly cared about his well-being. She had to do something, but what could a cleaning lady do against a powerful family? That afternoon, as she was finishing her shift on her last day in the ICU, Jake Matthews, Ethan's best friend, arrived for a visit. Sarah gathered her courage and approached him as he was leaving. "Mr. Matthews, can I talk to you for a minute?" Jake looked surprised, but nodded. "Sure, but how do you know my name?" "I'm Sarah Miller. I've been taking care of Mr. Thompson, Ethan, for the past 2 months." She hesitated before continuing. "I think his brother and fiancé are planning something bad." Jake's expression changed immediately. "I've had my suspicions too. What have you heard?" Sarah told him everything. The conversation about the wedding, the discussion about life support, and how she'd been reassigned after Ethan showed signs of improvement. Jake listened intently, his face growing more concerned. "I knew Alexander was making moves at the company, but I didn't think it would go this far." He rubbed his forehead. "We need proof before we can do anything. Without it, it's just your word against theirs." "I know," Sarah replied, feeling helpless. "But they're going to cut me off from him completely." Jake thought for a moment. "Not if I have anything to say about it. As Ethan's medical proxy and best friend, I have some rights too." He handed her his card. "Meet me tomorrow morning before your shift. We're going to make sure Ethan is protected." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. That night, as she made one final visit to room 507, she leaned close to Ethan's ear. "Don't give up, Ethan. I'll be back, I promise." And just as she was about to leave, she felt it again, the slight but unmistakable squeeze of his hand around hers. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. Her heart pounded as she waited in the cafeteria, nervously stirring her coffee. Jake Matthews entered, looking tired but determined. He nodded at her and sat down. "I spent all night going through Ethan's legal documents," he said, keeping his voice low. "As I suspected, I'm still listed as his medical proxy, not Alexander. Ethan never trusted his brother with those kinds of decisions." Sarah felt a wave of relief. "So, Alexander can't make decisions about Ethan's care?" "Not legally, no, but he's been throwing his weight around, and the hospital administration doesn't want to upset a major donor." Jake ran a hand through his hair. "I've arranged for you to be reinstated to the ICU. You'll be officially assigned to assist with Ethan's specialized care under my authority." "Thank you," Sarah said, her eyes filling with tears. "I was so worried about leaving him alone with them." Jake studied her face. "You really care about him, don't you? Not because he's Ethan Thompson, the billionaire, but just him." Sarah nodded, unable to deny what was becoming increasingly clear to her. "I've spent so many hours with him, talking to him, reading to him. Sometimes I feel like I know him better than people who've known him for years." "That might be true," Jake said with a sad smile. Ethan wasn't always good at letting people see the real him, too busy building his empire. They were interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Richards, who seemed surprised to see them together. "Mr. Matthews, Ms. Miller, I was just about to call you both. There's been a development with Ethan Thompson." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. "Is he okay?" "His brain activity has increased significantly overnight. We're running more tests, but it appears he might be emerging from the coma." The news spread quickly. Within hours, the hospital corridor outside room 507 was filled with reporters, business associates and lawyers. Alexander arrived looking flustered, with Olivia close behind. Her makeup was perfect as always, but there was panic in her eyes. "What's going on?" Alexander demanded when he saw Jake. "Why wasn't I informed immediately?" "I just found out myself," Jake replied coolly. "The doctors are hopeful, but they say it could still be days before he actually wakes up, if he does at all." Alexander pulled Jake aside, lowering his voice. "Listen, I know you think you're protecting Ethan's interests, but there are business matters at stake here. The company needs stability." "The company has been doing fine," Jake countered. "Unless you've been making changes that wouldn't be in Ethan's best interest." Alexander's face hardened. "I'm still the acting CEO, don't forget that." Inside room 507, Sarah was helping the nurses prepare for the additional tests. She noticed Olivia standing uncertainly in the doorway, her designer handbag clutched tightly. "Can I have a moment alone with my fiancé?" Olivia asked, her voice honeyed for the benefit of the nurse. The nurse nodded and left, but Sarah hesitated. "I need to finish changing these sheets," she said firmly. Olivia's smile vanished. "I know who you are. The little cleaning girl who thinks she's special because she reads books to a man who can't hear her. Stay away from Ethan. Once he wakes up, he won't need your pity company anymore." Sarah continued her work, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm just doing my job, Ms. Rothschild." Olivia stepped closer, dropping her voice to a whisper. "Do you think someone like him would ever look twice at someone like you? Don't be pathetic." Before Sarah could respond, the monitors attached to Ethan began beeping more rapidly. His fingers twitched and his eyelids fluttered. "He's responding," Sarah called out, immediately pressing the call button. Dr. Richards rushed in, followed by other medical staff. They surrounded the bed, checking vitals and pupil responses. "Mr. Thompson, can you hear me?" Dr. Richards asked, shining a light into Ethan's eyes. To everyone's amazement, Ethan's lips moved slightly as if trying to form words. The room fell silent. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Who are you?" Dr. Richards smiled. "I'm Dr. Richards. You're in St. Luke's Hospital. You've been in a coma for over 2 months following a car accident." Ethan's eyes opened fully, revealing confusion. He looked around the room, his gaze passing over Olivia without recognition, then landing on Sarah. For a moment, something like familiarity flickered in his expression. "Water," he managed to say. Sarah immediately poured a small cup and helped him take a sip. The simple act felt intensely intimate, and she was aware of Olivia's glare burning into her back. The next few hours were a flurry of activity. Specialists were called in, tests were ordered, and Alexander held an impromptu press conference in the hospital lobby, presenting himself as the devoted brother who had kept the company going during this difficult time. By evening, the initial excitement had settled into a new reality. Ethan Thompson was awake, but he wasn't himself. He had retrograde amnesia. He couldn't remember the accident or much of the year leading up to it. "It's quite common with traumatic brain injuries," Dr. Richards explained to the small group gathered in his office. Jake, Alexander, Olivia, and surprisingly Sarah, who had been asked to stay by Jake. "His memories may return gradually, or they may not. We simply can't predict. But he'll still be able to function normally?" Alexander asked, clearly concerned about business implications. "Cognitively, yes. All tests indicate his intellectual faculties are intact. But emotionally, this will be a difficult adjustment. Familiar faces and routines will be important." "When can he come home?" Olivia asked. I can take care of him at the penthouse. Dr. Richards shook his head. He's not ready for discharge. He'll need at least a few weeks of rehabilitation and monitoring here at the hospital. I want to see him, Jake said firmly. Alone. Alexander started to object, but Jake cut him off. As his medical proxy, I have that right. In room 507, Ethan was sitting up slightly, looking out the window at the autumn sunset. He turned when Jake entered, his expression brightening with recognition. Jake! Finally, someone I remember. Jake grinned, emotion evident on his face as he embraced his friend. You had us worried, man, so they tell me. 2 months? Ethan shook his head in disbelief. The last thing I remember clearly is the board meeting where we finalized the Davis Tech acquisition. Jake's smile faltered. That was almost a year ago, Ethan. A year? Ethan looked stunned. What about, they told me I was getting married? To Olivia Rothschild? You were supposed to. The day of your accident was your wedding day. Ethan fell. Silent, processing this information. I remember dating her, but marriage? It doesn't feel right. Jake hesitated, then spoke carefully. A lot changed in the months you don't remember. You became more driven. The company expanded rapidly. You and Olivia became the golden couple of New York society. And my brother. They said he's been running the company. Yes, and making changes you might not agree with. Ethan leaned back, against his pillows, looking exhausted. And who's the woman? The one in the blue uniform who gave me water? That's Sarah Miller. She's a hospital employee who's been taking care of you the whole time you were in the coma. Something shifted in Ethan's expression. She seems familiar somehow, like I know her voice. She read to you every night, talked to you. When everyone else was focused on your money and your company, she was here caring for you as a person. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I'd like to thank her. The days that followed brought gradual improvement to Ethan's physical condition. His strength returned slowly, and the periods of confusion decreased. But his memory remained fragmented, with the entire year before the accident existing as brief flashes and impressions rather than coherent memories. Olivia visited daily, always perfectly dressed and carrying expensive gifts. She tried to remind him of their relationship, showing him photos of glamorous events they had attended together. We were so happy, darling, she would say, sitting close to him on the bed. Everyone envied what we had. Ethan would nod politely, but Jake could see the discomfort in his friend's eyes. The man in those photos, immaculately groomed with a practiced smile and cold eyes, seemed like a stranger to him. Meanwhile, Alexander was growing increasingly anxious. He had made business decisions during Ethan's absence that would be difficult to explain, selling off promising divisions to competitors, restructuring the board to consolidate his own power, even beginning negotiations to merge with Davis Tech, their longtime rival. You need to focus on recovery, not business, Alexander insisted whenever Ethan asked questions about the company. Everything is under control, but Ethan's instincts told him otherwise. One afternoon, when he was alone, he asked a nurse to bring him a laptop. He was slowly scrolling through news articles about Thompson Technologies when Sarah entered the room. "Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt," she said, startled to find him awake and alert. "Sarah, right?" Ethan smiled, closing the laptop. "I've been hoping to talk to you." Sarah hesitated by the door. "I can come back later if you're busy." "No, please stay." He gestured to the chair beside his bed. "Jake told me how you took care of me while I was away." Sarah sat down, feeling strangely nervous. This was the first time they'd really been alone since he woke up. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Ethan said firmly. "From what I understand, you did much more than your job required. You kept me company when I was alone. You read to me, talked to me." Sarah looked down at her. "Hands. The doctors say people in comas might be able to hear what's going on around them. I thought you might like some company." "I think I did hear you," Ethan said softly. "When I first woke up, your voice was the only one that felt familiar." He paused. "Jake says you also noticed some concerning behavior from my brother and Olivia." Sarah's head snapped up. "He told you that?" "Yes, and I want to know everything you saw and heard. I may not remember who I was before the accident, but I need to understand what was happening around me while I was unconscious." Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell him everything. The conversations she had overheard, the plans for a bedside wedding, the discussions about life support, the secret meetings between Alexander and Michael Davis. Ethan listened intently, his expression growing more troubled with each revelation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you for being honest with me," he finally said. "It seems I have a lot to figure out about the people in my life." "I'm sorry," Sarah said. "I know this must be hard to hear." "Actually, it explains a lot." Ethan's eyes met hers. "Since waking up, I've felt disconnected from my old life. The company, Olivia, even my own home, none of it feels right. It's as if I'm being asked to step back into someone else's shoes." Sarah didn't know how to respond. This man was so different from the wealthy CEO the media portrayed. He was thoughtful, gentle, lacking the arrogance she had expected. "Can I ask you something personal?" Ethan said suddenly. "Of course. During all those hours you spent with me, did I ever respond? Give any sign that I could hear you?" Sarah smiled at the memory. "Once. I was telling you that you needed to wake up because things were happening that you needed to know about. I felt you squeeze my hand. It was very slight, but I know it was real." Ethan extended his hand toward her. After a moment's hesitation, Sarah placed her hand in his. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a connection that transcended their different worlds. "Thank you," he said simply, "for being the one person who cared about me for me, not for my money or power." From the doorway came the sound of someone clearing their throat. They turned to see Olivia standing there, her face a mask of controlled fury as she stared at their joined hands. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked, her voice dangerously sweet. Sarah quickly withdrew her hand and stood up. "I was just checking if Mr. Thompson needed anything." "How thoughtful," Olivia said coldly. "But I'm here now, so you can go." Sarah nodded and headed for the door, but Ethan's voice stopped her. "Sarah, thank you for everything. I hope we can continue our conversation soon." Olivia waited until Sarah was gone before turning to Ethan, her smile vanishing. "What conversation? What has that woman been telling you?" Ethan met her gaze steadily. "The truth, I think. Something I haven't been getting much of lately." Outside in the hallway, Sarah leaned against the wall, her heart racing. The connection she had felt with Ethan was undeniable, but she wasn't naive. He was Ethan Thompson, billionaire CEO, and she was just a hospital worker. Once he left the hospital and returned to his world of wealth and power, whatever was between them would surely fade. But as she walked away, she couldn't help remembering the words she had read to him from The Little Prince. What is essential is invisible to the eye. Perhaps some connections ran deeper than the visible differences that separated them. The confrontation with Olivia left Ethan troubled. After she finally left his room, he spent hours staring out the window, trying to reconcile the fragmented images in his mind with what he was learning about his life before the accident. The next morning, Dr. Richards arrived with good news. "Your latest tests look excellent, Mr. Thompson. If you continue to improve at this rate, we can start physical therapy tomorrow and possibly discuss discharge in a couple of weeks." "That's wonderful," Ethan said, though his enthusiasm was tempered by uncertainty. The prospect of returning to a life he barely remembered filled him with anxiety. "There is one thing," Dr. Richards added, checking his notes. "Your neurologist believes that revisiting familiar places and routines might help trigger memory recovery. Short excursions, if you feel up to it, could be beneficial." "I'd like that," Ethan said, suddenly eager for a change of scenery after months within the same four walls. Later that day, Jake arrived with a wheelchair and a mischievous grin. "Ready for a jailbreak? I got permission to take you for a spin around the hospital grounds." The autumn air was crisp as Jake pushed Ethan's wheelchair along the garden paths behind the hospital. Orange and red leaves crunched beneath the wheels, and Ethan took deep breaths of the fresh air, feeling more alive than he had since waking up. "So," Jake said as they paused by a small fountain, "have you made any decisions about what to do when you're discharged?" Ethan sighed. Everyone seems to have their own plans for me. Alexander wants me to ease back into the company, which probably means staying out of his way while he continues whatever he's been doing. Olivia is redecorating the penthouse and talking about a winter wedding. And what do you want? Jake asked quietly. I want to remember who I am, Ethan said, but I'm not sure I like what I'm learning about that person. Was I really that cold? That focused on money and status? Jake was silent for a moment. You changed after your father died. The pressure of taking over the company, proving yourself, it hardened you. The Ethan I knew in college, the one who wanted to create technology to help people, not just make profits, he got lost somewhere along the way. Ethan nodded slowly. That's what scares me, Jake. What if I go back to being that person? The one who would marry someone like Olivia just because she looks good on magazine covers. Maybe the accident was a second chance, Jake suggested. A chance to decide who you want to be now. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah, who was on her break and had come to the garden for some fresh air. She looked surprised to see them. Oh, I didn't know you were out here. I can leave. No, stay, Ethan said quickly. Please. Jake looked between them with a knowing smile. Actually, I need to make a few calls. I'll be back in 15 minutes. He patted Ethan's shoulder and walked toward the hospital, leaving them alone. Sarah hesitated, then sat on the bench near Ethan's wheelchair. How are you feeling today? Better, Ethan replied, studying her face in the sunlight. Dr. Richard says I might be able to go home in a couple of weeks. Something flickered across Sarah's face. Disappointment, perhaps. But she quickly smiled. That's wonderful news. You must be eager to get back to your life. Parts of it, Ethan admitted, but there's still so much I don't remember or understand. He paused, then asked the question that had been on his mind. What will you do? After I leave, I mean. Sarah looked surprised by the question. The same as always. Work my shifts, take care of patients. Will you miss me? The words slipped out before he could stop them. Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. It's been nice having someone to talk to. Most patients don't stay as long as you have. Ethan reached out and gently took her hand. I don't want to lose touch with you, Sarah. After everything you've done for me, everything you've told me, you're the one person I feel I can trust. The moment was broken by the sound of rapid footsteps approaching. They turned to see Olivia hurrying toward them, her high heels impractical on the garden path. There you are, she exclaimed, ignoring Sarah completely. I've been looking everywhere for you. The wedding planner needs to know if we should reschedule for December or wait until spring. Ethan withdrew his hand from Sarah's, but not quickly enough to escape Olivia's notice. Her eyes narrowed, but she maintained her smile. Wedding planner? Ethan repeated. Olivia, I just woke up from a coma. I'm not ready to plan a wedding. Of course, darling, I understand completely. Olivia bent down and kissed his cheek, marking it with her lipstick in a gesture that felt more like branding than affection. We'll take it one day at a time. Now, shall we go back inside? It's getting chilly out here. Sarah stood up. I should. Get back to work anyway, my break is almost over. As Olivia took control of the wheelchair, Ethan looked back at Sarah with regret in his eyes. She gave him a small smile before turning and walking away. That evening, Alexander arranged for a business dinner to be set up in a private room at the hospital. Several board members and key executives were present, all eager to see the returned CEO. The conversation was carefully steered toward positive company news, with Alexander playing the role of devoted brother perfectly. We've maintained steady growth despite the challenges, Alexander was saying as the dessert was served. The Davis partnership has been particularly promising. Partnership? Ethan questioned, picking up on the word. Last I remember, Davis Tech was our main competitor. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Alexander laughed it off. Just a small collaboration on a mutual project. Nothing to concern yourself with yet. Focus on getting better. But Ethan wasn't satisfied. After the others had left, he confronted his brother directly. What's really going on with the company, Alexander? And don't tell me to focus on my recovery. I may not remember everything, but I'm still the majority shareholder. Alexander's friendly demeanor vanished. You want the truth? Fine. The company was stagnating under your leadership. All those philanthropic projects were draining our resources. I've been steering us back toward profitability by selling off our most innovative divisions, by getting into bed with Michael Davis, who's been trying to steal our technology for years. Alexander's eyes widened slightly. How did you know about that? I have my sources, Ethan said coldly. Did you really think I wouldn't find out what you've been doing? Everything I've done has been legal, Alexander insisted. The board approved all major decisions. A board you've been manipulating while I was unconscious, Ethan countered. This ends now, Alexander. I may not be ready to return full-time, but I will be reviewing every decision you've made in my absence. Alexander's face hardened into a mask of resentment. You always were Father's favorite, the golden boy who could do no wrong. But where were you when the company needed real leadership? Off buying expensive toys and dating socialites. Maybe that was true before, Ethan admitted, but things are different now. Because of that cleaning girl? Alexander scoffed. Don't be ridiculous, Ethan. She's just using you to climb out of her pathetic little life. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Don't talk about her like that. Sarah is worth 10 of Olivia. And you. Alexander stood up, straightening his expensive suit. You're not thinking clearly. The doctors warned us your judgment might be impaired. Rest assured, I'll continue doing what's best for the company until you're truly ready to return. After Alexander left, Ethan sat alone, his mind racing. He needed help, someone he could trust, to give him accurate information about his company and his life. Jake was loyal, but he wasn't involved in the business side of things. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Sarah coming in to check on him before the end of her shift. I saw your brother leaving, she said cautiously. He looked angry. Ethan sighed. We had a disagreement about the company. Alexander's been making moves I don't agree with, but I don't have enough information to stop him yet. Sarah hesitated, then pulled something from her pocket, a small USB drive. I wasn't sure if I should give you this, but Jake asked me to keep it safe. He said it contains financial records and emails from your company, things he thought you should see when you were ready. Ethan stared at the tiny device. When did he give you this? About a month ago, after I overheard Alexander talking about something called Project Acquisition. Jake seemed really worried about it. Ethan took the drive, feeling its weight. So small, yet potentially so important. Thank you, Sarah. This could make all the difference. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I should go. Ms. Rothschild doesn't like me spending time with you. Sarah, wait. Ethan reached for her hand. I need to ask you something important. The night before my accident, the night before. What was supposed to be my wedding? Did I ever call you? Did we ever meet? Sarah looked confused. No. Why would you have? We'd never met before your accident. Ethan frowned, struggling with a fragmented memory that had been haunting him. I keep having this feeling, a memory of a conversation with a woman, someone telling me not to go through with the wedding, that Olivia wasn't right for me. It wasn't me, Sarah said gently. Maybe it was a dream, or a memory from shortly after the accident. Maybe. But Ethan wasn't convinced. The memory felt real, though just out of reach, like trying to recall a word on the tip of his tongue. The next morning, Ethan had his first physical therapy session. The months of inactivity had weakened his muscles, and the simple act of walking across the room left him exhausted. But he pushed himself, determined to regain his strength and independence as quickly as possible. After therapy, he returned to his room to find Olivia waiting with an interior designer, discussing changes to his penthouse apartment. "Darling, there you are," Olivia exclaimed. "We're just finalizing the plans for your home office renovation. I thought a lighter color palette would be more soothing during your recovery." Ethan looked at the samples spread across his bed, expensive fabrics and wallpapers in pale blues and grays. None of it felt like him, though he couldn't articulate why. "Can we discuss this later, Olivia? I'm tired from therapy." "Of course, honey." She dismissed the designer with a wave. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something important. The doctors mentioned you might be discharged soon, and I've been thinking about our living arrangements." Ethan tensed, knowing what was coming. "I think I should move in with you, at least temporarily," Olivia continued, "to help with your recovery. The penthouse is so large, and you'll need someone to take care of you. I appreciate the offer, Ethan said carefully, but I'm planning to hire professional help. A nurse, maybe a physical therapist to come to the house? Olivia's perfect smile faltered. You don't want me there. It's not that, Ethan lied, searching for the right words. I just think, given my memory issues, we should take things slowly. Get to know each other again before making any big decisions. Get to know each other? Olivia repeated incredulously. Ethan, we were about to get married. We've been together for nearly 2 years. Years that I don't remember, Ethan pointed out. I'm sorry, Olivia, but I can't pretend to feel something I don't. Not right now. Olivia's expression hardened. It's because of her, isn't it? That servant girl who's always hanging around you. This isn't about Sarah, Ethan said firmly, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. This is about me needing space to figure out who I am now. Olivia stood up, gathering her designer purse. Fine. Take your space. But don't expect me to wait forever, Ethan. There are plenty of men who would appreciate what I have to offer. After she stormed out, Ethan felt a surprising sense of relief. One complicated relationship temporarily managed. Now he needed to deal with his brother and the company. Using the laptop Jake had brought him, Ethan inserted the USB drive Sarah had given him. What he found made his blood run cold. Emails between Alexander and Michael Davis detailed plans for a hostile takeover, one that would essentially dissolve Thompson Technologies and fold its most valuable assets into Davis Tech. The partnership Alexander had mentioned was nothing more than a smokescreen for the systematic dismantling of the company their father had built. Most disturbing were the emails dated just before his accident, discussing the Ethan problem and how to handle him if he refused to approve the merger. Nothing explicitly illegal, but the tone was sinister enough to raise serious questions. Had his accident truly been an accident? The thought sent a chill through him. Ethan was still processing this information when Dr. Richards arrived for his evening checkup. The doctor seemed pleased with his progress. Your vital signs are excellent, and physical. Therapy reports you're ahead of schedule, he said, making notes in his chart. I think we can start discussing discharge plans, perhaps early next week. That's great news, Ethan replied, his mind still on the emails. Dr. Richards, can I ask you something about my accident? Of course. Was there anything unusual about it? Anything that might suggest it wasn't just a simple car crash? The doctor looked surprised by the question. The police report indicated you swerved to avoid an animal on the road. The skid marks confirmed that account. Why do you ask? Just trying to piece things together, Ethan said vaguely. One more thing. Who made the emergency call? Who found me after the crash? Dr. Richards thought for a moment. I believe it was an anonymous call. Someone using a payphone, if I remember correctly. The police never identified them. After the doctor left, Ethan sat back, considering this new information. An anonymous caller. A convenient accident right before his wedding, right before he might have discovered what Alexander and Davis were planning. It felt too coincidental. That night, as he drifted off to sleep, the fragmented memory returned, more vivid this time. A woman's voice, urgent and concerned. You can't trust them, Ethan, not Alexander, not Olivia. They're planning something. Don't go through with the wedding. But whose voice was it? Not Sarah's. They hadn't met before the accident, not Olivia's. Then who? Ethan was awakened from his troubled sleep by a soft touch on his arm. Opening his eyes, he was surprised to find Sarah standing by his bed, looking worried. I'm sorry to wake you, she whispered, but something's happening. Alexander is here, with some lawyers, and they're talking to Dr. Richards about moving you to a private facility tomorrow morning. Ethan sat up, instantly alert. What did you hear? Why? Sarah nodded, her expression grave. They're saying it's for specialized rehabilitation, but I overheard one of the lawyers mention something about mental competency and conservatorship. Ethan, I think they're trying to get control over your medical decisions and maybe more. Ethan's mind raced. After discovering the emails, Alexander must have realized Ethan was gathering information. This was his counter-move. Get Ethan declared mentally incompetent and take legal control of his affairs. Where's Jake? Ethan asked urgently. We need to call him. I tried, but his phone goes straight to voicemail. Sarah bit her lip. What should we do? Ethan made a quick decision. Help me get dressed, we're leaving tonight. Sarah's eyes widened. Leaving? But you haven't been discharged. You're still recovering. I'll recover better somewhere Alexander can't find me, Ethan said firmly. Will you help me? Sarah hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, but where will you go? Ethan looked at her, a plan forming in his mind. Do you trust me, Sarah? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Then I need to ask you for something bigger than reading books or bringing water. I need somewhere to stay, somewhere no one would think to look for Ethan Thompson. Understanding dawned in her eyes. My apartment? You want to stay at my place? Just for a few days until I can contact my lawyers and make sure Alexander can't take control. Ethan met her gaze directly. I know it's a lot to ask. Sarah took a deep breath, then nodded. Okay, my shift ends in 20 minutes. I can bring my car around to the service entrance. No one will notice us leaving that way. As she helped him dress and gather his few personal belongings, Ethan felt a mix of emotions: fear about what Alexander might be planning, determination to reclaim his company, and underneath it all, a strange excitement at the thought of escaping, with Sarah to her world, so different from his own. Thank you, he said softly, as she helped him into a wheelchair. I know this could cost you your job. Sarah smiled, a spark of adventure in her eyes. Some things are worth the risk. Together they slipped out of room 507 and down the back corridor, leaving behind the hospital world that had been their shared reality for the past 2 months. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and perhaps something neither of them had expected to find, a chance at love that transcended the boundaries of their different worlds. The night air was cool as Sarah drove through the quiet streets of the city. Beside her, Ethan sat in silence, watching the unfamiliar neighborhoods pass by outside the window. They were far from the upscale areas where he supposedly lived, the parts of town that appeared in society magazines and real estate listings for the wealthy. Are you sure you're feeling okay? Sarah asked, glancing at him with concern. We can stop if you need to rest. I'm fine, Ethan assured her, though he was feeling the strain of the escape. Just focused on what comes next. Sarah's apartment was on the 3rd floor of an older building in a modest neighborhood. There was no elevator, and Ethan had to lean heavily on her as they made their way up the stairs, his legs still weak from months of inactivity. I know it's not what you're used to, Sarah said apologetically as she unlocked the door. It's small, but it's clean and quiet. Ethan stepped inside and looked around the small but tidy apartment. The living room was simply furnished with a worn but comfortable-looking sofa, a small dining table with 2 chairs, and bookshelves lining one wall, filled with well-read paperbacks. Through an open door, he could see a tiny kitchen. It's perfect, he said sincerely. Thank you for bringing me here. Sarah smiled, visibly relieved by his reaction. You can take the bedroom. I'll sleep on the couch. I can't put you out of your bed, Ethan protested. Are you still recovering? Sarah insisted. Besides, I fall asleep on that couch all the time while reading. It's actually very comfortable. Too exhausted to argue, Ethan allowed her to show him to the bedroom, a small room with a neatly made double bed and a dresser. Photos on the wall showed Sarah with an older couple who had her same warm smile. Her parents, he assumed. Are you hungry? Sarah asked. I can make you something to eat. Maybe just some tea if you have it, Ethan replied, suddenly aware of how tired he felt. The adrenaline of their escape was wearing off. While Sarah went to the kitchen, Ethan sat on the edge of the bed, taking in his surroundings. This simple room, with its faded curtains and mismatched furniture, felt more like a home than the luxury penthouse he supposedly owned. There was a warmth here, a sense of being in a place where someone actually lived, not just displayed their wealth. Sarah returned with 2 mugs of tea and sat beside him on the bed. So, what's the plan now? Ethan took a sip before answering. I need to contact my lawyer, not the company lawyers, but my personal attorney. Then I need to get access to my private accounts, ones Alexander doesn't know about. You have secret accounts? Sarah asked, surprised. Ethan smiled slightly. Apparently I wasn't completely trusting even before the accident. Jake mentioned that I kept some assets separate from the company as a precaution. Smart move, as it turns out. They talked for another hour, planning their next steps. Ethan would call his attorney first thing in the morning, then arrange to meet Jake at a secure location. Sarah would go to work as usual to avoid suspicion, but she would be careful not to reveal anything about Ethan's whereabouts. As they finished their tea, Sarah stood up. "You should get some rest. It's been a long day." "Sarah," Ethan said, catching her hand before she could leave. "Thank you. Not just for tonight, but for everything. For caring about me when I was just an unconscious stranger." She squeezed his hand gently. "Get some sleep. We'll figure everything out tomorrow." Alone in the small bedroom, surrounded by the faint scent of Sarah's perfume on the pillows, Ethan fell into the deepest, most peaceful sleep he'd had since waking from the coma. Morning brought chaos. Sarah's phone rang just as she was preparing to leave for her shift. It was Jake, sounding frantic. "Where are you?" he demanded. "Is Ethan with you? The hospital is in an uproar. Alexander's called the police, claiming Ethan's been kidnapped." "What?" Sarah exclaimed, looking at Ethan, who had emerged from the bedroom at the sound of her alarmed voice. "That's ridiculous." "Of course it is, but Alexander's telling everyone that Ethan's mentally impaired from the brain injury and that someone took advantage of his confusion. They're reviewing security footage now." Sarah's heart sank. "They'll see us leaving together." "Exactly. You need to get Ethan somewhere safe. Alexander's serious about the conservatorship. He had the papers ready to file this morning." Ethan took the phone from Sarah. "Jake, it's me. I need you to contact Gerald Winters. He's my personal attorney, not connected to the company. Tell him what's happening and that I need to see him immediately." After getting Jake's promise to help, Ethan hung up and turned to Sarah, whose face had gone pale. "They're going to arrest me," she said quietly. "They'll say I kidnapped you." Ethan took her hands firmly in his. "No one is arresting you. You helped me leave voluntarily, but we do need to move quickly. Is there somewhere else we can go, somewhere Alexander wouldn't think to look?" Sarah thought for a moment. "My parents have a cabin about 2 hours north of here. They only use it during fishing season, so it's empty now." "That's perfect," Ethan said. "Let's go." They packed quickly, Sarah grabbing some clothes and necessities, Ethan collecting the laptop and USB drive with the evidence against Alexander. As they were about to leave, there was a sharp knock at the door. They froze, exchanging alarmed glances. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Ms. Miller, this is Detective Collins with the City Police. We need to speak with you." Sarah looked at Ethan in panic. He gestured toward the fire escape outside the bedroom window. She nodded in understanding. "Just a minute," she called out, then whispered to Ethan, "Go, I'll meet you at the car." "I'm not leaving you. You have to," she insisted. "If they find you here, they'll never believe you came willingly." "I'll stall them while you get to the car. I'll be right behind you." Reluctantly, Ethan made his way to the bedroom window and out onto the fire escape. The metal creaked under his weight as he carefully descended to the alley below. His legs, still weak from months of inactivity, threatened to give out, but determination kept him moving. Inside the apartment, Sarah took a deep breath and opened the door. 2 police officers stood there, looking serious. "Sarah Miller," the older one, asked. "I'm Detective Collins. We need to ask you some questions about Ethan Thompson." "Ethan Thompson?" Sarah repeated, feigning confusion. "The billionaire who was in the hospital? What about him?" "He disappeared from St. Luke's Hospital last night. Security footage shows. You leaving with him?" "His family is very concerned about his safety." Sarah managed to look appropriately shocked. "He asked me to help him leave. He was afraid of his brother. Mr. Thompson is an adult who made his own decision to leave the hospital." "I understand," the detective said, his tone softening slightly. "But his medical team is concerned about his mental state. He may not be fully capable of making rational decisions right now." "That's not true," Sarah insisted. "He's perfectly rational. His brother is trying to take control of his company while he's vulnerable." The detective exchanged a glance with his partner. "May we come in, Ms. Miller, just to talk?" "I'm actually on my way to work," Sarah said, glancing at her watch. "I'm going to be late." "This won't take long," Detective Collins said, his tone making it clear it wasn't a request. Sarah reluctantly stepped aside to let them enter. As the officers looked around her apartment, she silently prayed that Ethan had made it safely to the car. "Is Mr. Thompson here, Ms. Miller?" the detective asked directly. "No," she answered truthfully, "but you do know where he is." Sarah hesitated, torn between protecting Ethan and avoiding a direct lie to the police. "He's safe. That's all that matters." Detective Collins sighed. "Ms. Miller, I understand you might think you're helping him, but Mr. Thompson's family has legal documentation stating he needs supervised medical care. By helping him leave without medical clearance, you could be facing serious charges." "What kind of charges?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Potentially kidnapping, if his family pushes for it. At minimum, criminal negligence and interfering with medical care." Sarah felt her stomach drop. She could lose her job, face legal charges, her entire life could be destroyed. But the alternative was betraying Ethan, leaving him vulnerable to Alexander's schemes. "I'd like to speak with a lawyer," she finally said. The detective nodded. "That's your right, but I'm going to need you to come down to the station with us to make a formal statement." As the officers escorted her from the apartment, Sarah caught a glimpse of her car in the parking lot with no sign of Ethan. Had he made it away safely, or had Alexander's people found him? While Sarah was being questioned at the police station, Ethan was in a taxi heading toward the outskirts of the city. After waiting in Sarah's car and realizing she wasn't coming, he had been forced to make a decision. He couldn't risk being found there, but he couldn't leave without knowing what had happened to her. He directed the taxi to a small motel, paid cash for a room, and immediately called Jake. "Sarah's been taken to the police station," Jake told him after making some calls. "They're questioning her, but she hasn't been formally charged with anything yet. Alexander is pushing hard, though. He's got doctors willing to testify that you're not mentally competent." "We need to move fast," Ethan said, his voice tense with worry for Sarah. "Did you reach Gerald Winters?" "Yes, he's preparing the legal counterattack as we speak. But Ethan, we need you to be examined by independent doctors who can certify you're of sound mind." "Arrange it," Ethan said. "And Jake, I need one more thing, those emails on the USB drive. I need them authenticated and documented properly. They're our best evidence against Alexander." "I'm on it. Where are you now?" Ethan hesitated. "Better you don't know exactly, but I'm safe. Call me when you have news about Sarah." The hours crawled by as Ethan waited in the motel room, his mind consumed with worry for Sarah and anger at his brother. How had he never seen Alexander's true nature before? Or had he seen it and chosen to ignore it, too focused on building his empire to notice the threat within his own family? As evening approached, his phone rang. An unknown number. Cautiously, he answered. "Mr. Thompson, this is Gerald Winters, your attorney. Mr. Matthews gave me this number." Relief washed over Ethan. "Gerald, thank you for calling. What's happening?" "I've been busy on your behalf, sir. I've filed emergency motions to block your brother's conservatorship petition and secured affidavits from several specialists questioning the medical basis for his claims." "What about Sarah Miller? Is she still being detained?" "She's been released for now with instructions not to leave town. Your brother wanted charges filed immediately, but the district attorney is hesitant. It seems Ms. Miller has been quite convincing about acting under your direct instructions." Ethan smiled, picturing Sarah standing her ground against the police and Alexander. "She was. I need to see her." "That may not be wise at the moment, Mr. Thompson. The police are watching." "Her? Find a way, Gerald. She risked everything for me. I won't leave her to face this alone." After ending the call, Ethan paced the small motel room, feeling trapped and useless. Sarah was in trouble because of him, and here he was, hiding. It wasn't right. A soft knock at the door startled him. Cautiously, he approached. "Who is it?" "Delivery for room 14, came the reply. Ethan hadn't ordered anything. Suspicious, he peered through the peephole and saw Jake standing there with 2 takeout bags. Relief flooded through him as he opened the door. "How did you find me?" Jake grinned. "You always were predictable in a crisis. This is the same motel we stayed at when your Ferrari broke down on that road trip in college." He stepped inside, placing the food on the small table. "And I brought someone who's very anxious to see you." From behind Jake appeared Sarah, looking tired but unharmed. Without thinking, Ethan pulled her into a tight embrace. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I was so worried." Sarah nodded against his chest. "I'm fine. They just asked a lot of questions. Your lawyer was amazing. He showed up at the station and shut everything down." She pulled back to look at him. "But Ethan, they're still looking for you. Alexander's telling everyone you're having some kind of mental breakdown." "Not for much longer," Jake interjected. "Gerald has arranged for a press conference tomorrow morning. We're going public with everything. Alexander's secret deals with Davis, the conservatorship attempt, all of it." "Will that be enough?" Sarah asked worriedly. Jake's expression was grim. "It's a start, but Alexander won't go down without a fight. He's already spinning a story about Ethan being manipulated by a hospital worker who took advantage of his vulnerable state." "That's ridiculous," Ethan said angrily. "No one who spends 5 minutes with Sarah would believe that." "Alexander can be very convincing," Jake warned. "And he has the support of most of the board now, plus Olivia is backing his version of events." They ate dinner while discussing strategy. Gerald had arranged for Ethan to be examined by 3 independent neurologists the next morning before the press conference. If they certified him as mentally competent, Alexander's legal case would collapse. As the evening wore on, Jake stood to leave. "I should go before anyone notices I'm missing. The motel is paid up for 3 days and I've registered it under a fake name. You should be safe here until tomorrow." After Jake left, an awkward silence fell between Ethan and Sarah. The small motel room suddenly seemed very intimate. "You should take the bed," Ethan said. "I can sleep in the chair." Sarah shook her head. "You're still recovering. You need proper rest before tomorrow." "We could share," Ethan suggested hesitantly. "It's a queen size, plenty of room for both of us." Sarah blushed slightly but nodded. "Okay." Later, as they lay side by side in the darkness, Ethan found himself unable to sleep. The woman next to him had risked everything, her job, her freedom, her future for him. Not for Ethan Thompson, the billionaire, but for him, the broken man who had woken up to a life he didn't recognize. "Sarah," he whispered, unsure if she was still awake. "Yes?" came her soft reply. "When this is all over, when Alexander is dealt with and things are settled, what will you do?" She was quiet for a moment. "Go back to my life, I suppose, if the hospital will still have me. And if I asked you to stay in my life? Not as someone who takes care of me, but as something more." He felt her shift to face him in the darkness. "Ethan, our worlds are so different. You belong in boardrooms and penthouse apartments. I belong in hospital corridors and small apartments with fire escapes. Maybe I don't want that world anymore," Ethan said, reaching out to touch her face gently. "Maybe waking up from that coma gave me a second chance to choose a different path. A better one." Sarah's hand covered his. "You say that now, but when your memory returns, when you're back in your old life, even if every memory came back this instant," Ethan interrupted, "it wouldn't change how I feel about you. You saw me, Sarah, not the billionaire, not the CEO, just me. No one has ever done that before." In the darkness of the motel room, they found each other. The kiss was tender at first, then deeper, full of the emotions that had been building between them for months, since those quiet nights when Sarah read to an unconscious man, caring for him when everyone else cared only for what he could give. Them. Morning came too quickly. They were awakened by a call from Gerald Winters, informing them that a car would pick them up in an hour for Ethan's neurological exams. As they dressed and prepared to leave their temporary sanctuary, a nervous energy filled the air. "Whatever happens today," Ethan said, taking Sarah's hands in his, "we face it together. I won't let Alexander hurt you." Sarah squeezed his hands. "I'm more worried about you. Alexander won't give up easily." The neurological exams took place at a private clinic. 3 different specialists examined Ethan thoroughly, testing his cognitive functions, memory, and decision-making abilities. After 2 hours, they delivered their unanimous conclusion. Ethan Thompson was of sound mind, fully capable of managing his own affairs and making informed decisions. Armed with these professional opinions, Gerald Winters prepared for the press conference. News of Ethan Thompson's disappearance and the ensuing drama had made headlines, and reporters from every major outlet were gathered in the hotel conference room, eager for the story. Alexander arrived moments before the press conference was scheduled to begin, his face darkening with rage when he saw Ethan standing at the back of the room with Sarah and Jake. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he hissed, approaching his brother. "Do you have any idea what damage this publicity will do to the company?" "I think the damage began when you started selling off our father's legacy to Michael Davis," Ethan replied calmly. "It ends today, Alexander." Before Alexander could respond, Gerald Winters stepped to the podium and began the press conference. He methodically laid out the facts: Ethan's complete medical clearance by multiple specialists, the attempted conservatorship, filing by Alexander, and most damaging of all, the evidence of corporate malfeasance, emails and documents showing Alexander's secret negotiations with Davis Tech. As reporters fired questions, Ethan stepped forward to address them directly. "I want to make one thing absolutely clear," he said, his voice strong and confident. "I left the hospital voluntarily because I had evidence that my brother was attempting to seize control of both my personal affairs and my company through fraudulent claims about my mental competency." A reporter raised her hand. "Mr. Thompson, your brother claims that Sarah Miller, a hospital employee, took advantage of your vulnerable state to manipulate you. How do you respond?" Ethan's expression hardened. "That accusation is not only false, it's despicable. Ms. Miller is the one person in this entire situation who has acted with complete integrity. While my brother was selling off company assets and my fiancée was planning our wedding while I lay unconscious, Sarah Miller was reading to me, talking to me, and ultimately warning me about the plots being formed around me." He reached out and took Sarah's hand, drawing her forward to stand beside him. "Without her, I might never have discovered what was happening until it was too late." The gesture did not go unnoticed by the press. Cameras flashed as Ethan stood proudly with Sarah, their hands joined. "Are you saying you and Ms. Miller are in a relationship?" another reporter asked. Ethan looked at Sarah, a question in his eyes. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I'm saying that sometimes you find the most valuable things in life where you least expect them," Ethan replied. "My accident and coma might seem like tragedies, but they led me to someone who cares about me as a person, not as a bank account or a corporate asset. So yes, Sarah and I are together, and I couldn't be prouder of that fact." The press conference continued with Gerald outlining the legal actions being taken against Alexander, including his immediate removal from any position within Thomson Technologies and a full investigation into his dealings with Davis Tech. Throughout it all, Alexander stood at the back of the room, his face a mask of cold fury. When the formal questioning ended and reporters began to disperse, he approached Ethan one last time. "You think this is over?" he said in a low, threatening voice. "This is just the beginning. You've made a powerful enemy today, brother." "No." "Alexander," Ethan replied calmly. "Today I finally recognized an enemy who's been there all along. The difference is, now I'm awake." As Alexander stormed out, Olivia appeared, looking both angry and calculating. She eyed Sarah with undisguised contempt before turning to Ethan. "So this is your choice, trading me for your cleaning lady? Do you have any idea how ridiculous you look?" Ethan met her gaze steadily. "I think I look like a man who finally knows what matters, Olivia. And it was never the things you cared about." Olivia's perfect features twisted briefly with rage before she composed herself. "You'll regret this, Ethan, when the novelty wears off and you're left with her." "No," Ethan said with quiet certainty. "The only thing I regret is that it took a coma for me to see what was right in front of me all along." As Olivia flounced away, Sarah turned to Ethan with concern in her eyes. "They're not going to give up, are they?" "Probably not," Ethan admitted. "But neither are we." In the weeks that followed, Ethan slowly reclaimed his life, but not the life he had led before. With Jake's help, he restructured the company leadership, appointing trusted executives to key positions while he focused on recovery and a new direction for Thomson Technologies. The penthouse apartment was sold, and Ethan bought a more modest home in a quieter neighborhood, one with a garden and space for the library of books that Sarah had introduced him to during his time in the hospital. Not all of his memories returned, but enough came back to fill in the important pieces. He remembered the person he had been before the accident, driven, cold, focused solely on success and status. It was like looking at a stranger, one he had no desire to become again. One evening, 6 months after the accident, Ethan and Sarah sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sunset. Sarah was reading aloud from a dog-eared copy of The Little Prince, just as she had done during those long nights in the hospital. "It is only with the heart that one can see rightly," she read. "What is essential is invisible to the eye." Ethan smiled, reaching over to take her hand. "I think I finally understand what that means." Sarah closed the book, returning his smile. "And what does it mean?" "That sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters." He brushed a strand of hair from her face tenderly. "I had to lose my memory, my company, even my sense of self, to find you." Sarah leaned into his touch. "Do you ever regret it? Giving up that life? The penthouse, the society parties, all of it?" Ethan shook his head. "How can I regret trading emptiness for fulfillment? Besides," he added with a grin, "I kept the Ferrari." Sarah laughed, the sound filling the evening air. "Some things are worth keeping." "Yes," Ethan agreed, pulling her close. "Some things are definitely worth keeping." As they sat together, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, Ethan realized that his accident hadn't been the tragedy everyone thought. It had been an awakening, from a life of sleepwalking through meaningless success to one truly lived, with purpose and love. Sometimes you had to lose everything to find what was truly essential, and sometimes what was essential had been there, all along waiting patiently for you to wake up and see it with your heart. The end.